Hi, this is Sharon Voida, and I'm the city's finance director. Today, Eric King and I are going to walk through a presentation that contains an overview of the city's finances and its connection to street maintenance. So the three main topics we're going to cover, as I mentioned, an overview of city funds and how that ties to the streets budget, which is kind of the focus of today's presentation. And then Eric will jump in with a discussion about the Street Maintenance Funding Committee and some of the recommendations that came out of that committee process. So the overview of city funds. The city has about a $630 million biennial budget. So in order to kind of streamline that budget down and simplify it to take the biennial budget to an annual budget number that's a little easier for people to understand, we have about $142 million of revenues received by the city on an annual basis for operations. So that excludes any debt proceeds or any interfund activity running through the city's budget. Of that $142 million of operating revenues, 101 of that is restricted, which means council does not have discretion over the use of those funds. For example, we have urban renewal taxes, the general obligation bond taxes, which was the general obligation bond for transportation improvements such as Reed Market and the 18th and Empire roundabout that was approved by the voters in 2011. The transient room tax, also referred to as the motel taxes, a portion of those taxes are restricted for tourism promotion. The city receives about $4.5 million annually from the state of Oregon for the state highway gas tax, and then the 20-cent fire levy that was approved by the voters in 2014. Those are all restricted taxes. Permit fees, which are your community development, kind of building, planning, engineering fees, those are restricted for those development activities, as are water and sewer and stormwater utility fees and system development charges, also referred to as impact fees in some other states and cities. Those are restricted for growth and development of future infrastructure. So those are all restricted. So for example, when you pay your monthly utility bill, your water, sewer, and stormwater fees are only used for operation and maintenance of those utility systems. The city does not have the discretion to reallocate or divert those fees to street maintenance or public safety or anything other than those utilities. And then finally, the city also receives grants for specific purposes. For example, we have grants from the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA for airport, and those grants are reserved and restricted for specific uses. So for comparison, as I said, we have $101 million of restricted revenues. There's about $41 million that council has discretion over, the largest being property taxes, the remainder of the transient room taxes or motel taxes, and we also receive some state shared revenues from the state of Oregon, primarily like cigarette and liquor taxes that council has discretion over the use of those funds. We also get franchise fees, which are fees that the local utility companies pay for use of the city's use of the city's right-of-way. And those fees go into the general fund as discretionary revenues. And then you can see the small little kind of blue sliver at the bottom of that cylinder for municipal court fines, which are the traffic and kind of BIN code citation revenues. So you can see out of that $630 million biennial budget, when you drill down to kind of the annual operating revenues coming into the city, council only has discretion over about $41 million. The previous slide focused on revenues coming into the city and the general fund. So we want to transition to this current slide of looking at how that $41 million of discretionary revenues are spent. So this chart is a 7-year trend of the general fund allocations and support by core service area. You can see that public safety, which is our police, municipal court, and fire operations, receive the bulk of general fund allocations, and that's about 80%. Streets is the kind of brownish line on this chart. At the beginning of this period, fiscal year 2009-2010, streets received about 3% of general fund allocations. And for the 15-16 adjusted budget, that has increased to 13% of general fund allocations. So streets has seen the largest increase in general fund support over the last 7 years. Community and economic development, the blue shaded area, the increase you see in that allocation at the end of the last couple of years of this chart is primarily related to the Urban Growth Boundary, or UGB, remand project. There's quite a bit of consultant work involved in that project. So when that consultant work is completed, we'll see the general fund allocations for community and economic development reduced, probably beginning in the 2017-2019 biennium. Transit is the purple shaded area. Transit receives about 3% of the general fund allocations. So even though the transit system is not operated by the city, it's operated by the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, or COIC, as the Cascades East Transit System. Even though the city is no longer operating transit, we do provide financial support to serve as grant match that helps cover the cost of their operations, as that system does serve the citizens and residents of Bend. And the other community services and internal needs, kind of gray shading at the top, you can see the largest decrease in general fund allocations is in that area. And that is primarily related to general fund support in the first couple of years of this trend analysis, where the general fund was contributing to our IT department to contribute to the cost of replacing the city's 26-year-old enterprise resource planning ERP system. We're replacing our core financial system. So the general fund did contribute money at the beginning of this 7-year trend. So this slide is kind of a high-level summary of the general fund support by primary program or core service area. And I did want to mention, before we move on to some discussion of property taxes, you'll see the allocation to the fire department in red is separate from police and municipal court. We didn't group all of our public safety operations together because the city has a contract with the Rural Fire Protection District, where both agencies will contribute a portion of their property tax, permanent property tax rate, to the fire department. So the city is obligated to contribute $1.18 per thousand of our taxable assessed value to the fire department, and that is contractually obligated. If the city wanted to renegotiate that contract with the district, we are required to give them a 3-year advance notice. So there is not a lot of discretion over the amount of general fund dollars contributed to the fire department. This slide is a comparison of property tax revenues that are generated for some of Bend's comparable cities. We've looked at most cities in Oregon with populations about our size, but we've also included Redmond, even though they have a smaller population, given their proximity to Bend and that the fact that they provide similar services as Bend, we've included them in this analysis. What this shows is when you apply the property tax rates in each of these cities to the median assessed value in each city, this illustrates the amount of revenues generated for each location, each city, based on kind of an average household in town. So for example, Bend, if you look at the red shaded amount, the $528, that's the amount that an average household in Bend with a home with an assessed value at about $188,000, that's how much the city's general fund receives in revenues from that home. So you can see $528 from the permanent rate that goes into the general fund, $38, which is the yellow shading for the fire local option levy. The purple is of $311. That's the revenue an average home pays to the Parks District, which is a separate taxing district and not affiliated with the city of Bend at all. And then the general obligation bond that was approved in 2011 for transportation improvements, that generates about $40 a year. So the next slide will go into a little more detail of how those revenues for the City of Bend are allocated. So this next slide shows that for an average home with $188,000 taxable assessed value, they're paying $2,879 in property taxes per year. Of that, $606 goes to the City of Bend for the general obligation bond, the fire local option levy, and then, if you remember on the previous slide, the $528 for the city's permanent rate. So of that $528 of property taxes going into the general fund, about $51 of that gets allocated to streets. So the average homeowner in Bend is paying $51 a year, contributing $51 a year to street maintenance. $262 for fire, which again includes the local option levy. They pay about $197 a year for police protection and public safety, $32 a year for community and economic development, $12 for transit, and then $12 other miscellaneous. You can see this is the same for the Parks District, $311 that was reflected on the previous slide in that purple shaded area. For comparison purposes, we took, it's not a scientific sample, we talked to 3 different folks in town that are members of a homeowners association to look and see how much that home is paying per year in HOA dues. So we have 3 different examples. One is a home that pays $229 a year, and that covers 2 acres of common area landscaping, maintenance of the alley behind their homes, and snow plowing. There's another neighborhood that's on private streets, so they pay $609 per year for lawn maintenance, snow removal, and since they're on private streets, they are also paying in to build reserves to replace and repave that private street. And then there was another person we spoke to that pays about $800 a year for their common area landscaping, and their community has a shared pool, gym, and clubhouse, and also enforcement of their CC&Rs. So that gives you kind of a high-level example of what some citizens are paying per year in homeowner association dues compared to what they are also paying for city services. $51 for streets, $262 for fire and EMS protection, and $197 per year for police and public safety. So we're now going to transition over to the streets budget. And the streets fund, or the streets budget, gets about 47% of the funding for that program comes from the state highway gas tax. It's about $4.5 million per year. About a third of their funding comes from the city's general fund. 13% is other local income. We have garbage. The garbage companies pay a franchise fee for the operations and maintenance that's required on the roadways from the heavy equipment that's driving on the streets for the garbage service. There's also work that our streets department does. They do some self-performed work for other city operations. They do self-performed accessibility improvements such as curb ramps and sidewalk repairs. They also perform landscaping services for some of our water and sewer facilities. And then about 8% of their revenue comes from the federal government. It's actually a pass-through of transportation revenues through our Metropolitan Planning Organization. So that was the kind of where the revenue is coming from, and this is where the money has gone. So this is a 5-year historical look at the streets budget. You can see the first 3 years going back to fiscal year 2012, 2013, their budget was about $10 million a year. Fiscal year 12-13, it was about 9.4 and grew to about $10 million in 14-15. fiscal year 15-16 and 16-17, these are all adjusted budgets. So that the 15-16, 16-17 for the current biennium reflects budget increases approved by City Council last November, in November 2015. Prior to those increases, the streets budget was about $10.2 million for the current biennium, so pretty consistent with prior years. This slide shows the year-end reserves or ending fund balance in the streets fund. And this is important to point out because you can see in fiscal year 11-12, there was almost $4 million of reserves in the streets fund. Since that time, we have intentionally been spending down our reserves in an effort to dedicate as much money as possible to street maintenance. At the end of the current biennium, the 15-17 biennium, we're projected to have about $1.1 million in reserves in the streets fund, which is actually lower than our fiscal policies and our target. Our target is to have about 2 months of operating expenditures in reserves, and the 1.1 will actually give us about 1 month of reserves. But we were okay with doing that. We wanted to, it's still a fiscally conservative reserve level, but we wanted to be able to dedicate as much money to street maintenance. And the need for those reserves are, for example, snow removal, big snow events. We budget for about 1 or 2 big snow events per year. And if we end up with more than that and have to call out contractors and do more snow removal across the city, we need the money in reserves to do that. It also is set aside for major equipment repair or replacement. So again, we budget for ongoing repair and maintenance of our equipment, but if there was a significant equipment breakdown, we need the money in reserves to cover that. And the final slide that I want to go over before turning it over to Eric to talk about the Street Maintenance Committee, this graph is a nice illustration, I think, of kind of how we got to where we are. So as it says at the top, the cost of maintaining and repairing our roads has far outpaced revenue, creating a declining trend in road conditions. So the red $ line is the cost of doing business. It's our materials, asphalt. Over the last 10 years, we've seen about a 300% increase in our material costs, while the total lane miles, population, and street budget, which is the kind of the green cars, they have each had about a 30% increase. So the number of lane miles and the budget has increased commensurately with the increase in our population, but the cost has far outpaced that. So the result of increasing costs more than we have revenues to cover is the degradation of our street condition, or the pavement condition index, the PCI, which you can see by the declining black line at the bottom, which is a declining road. To give you some idea, in 2004, our overlay costs were about $22,000 per lane mile, and the last contracts that we entered into in 2015, that same lane mile of overlay was costing the city $84,000. And we get questions sometimes about our public process and procurement process, and we do low bid those contracts. So those are all low bid, but over that period, the cost have increased almost 300%. It's about 280%. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Hi there, this is Eric King. I'm the city manager, and I'm going to be finishing up the presentation talking about the Street Maintenance Funding Committee that dove into this issue in much more detail, as well as a summary of the decision that Council made that led to the fuel tax proposal. First off, the committee that was formed was selected by a combination of the Bend Chamber of Commerce, Bend 2030, and City Council members. It included 13 individuals ranging from the Environmental Center to the fuel industry, small businesses that are dependent upon the fuel, neighborhood associations, budget committee members. In total, they met for about 3 months and really walk through a lot of different scenarios, got a deeper understanding of the budget, where the resources are allocated. Ultimately, they focused in on 3 scenarios. What would it take to improve the roads? How much additional revenue is needed? And as shown here on the slide, that is $6 million per year dedicated to street preservation to improve the overall condition. We're at about a 68 from a scale of 0 to 100. The idea is to improve that PCI year over year. What happened if we just maintained our roads where they're at today at a 68, which does require $2.5 million of dedicated revenue towards street preservation? And then if we did nothing, if we did not invest any additional dollars than what we had been investing in today, what would happen to the condition of our roads? Really, all options were explored. So I would say the 3 main areas of exploration include looking at existing resources and how to reallocate existing resources, drawing down reserves to our minimum policy levels. So we have financial policies that guide how much savings we should have in the city. Getting those to bare minimum levels was one strategy. And then, only then, after the revenue was identified from those 2 other sources, did we look at new revenue. So the result of this group, this shows the history of street preservation expenditures. They range from about $1.5 million to a little over $2 million over the last couple of years, and that's fluctuated because of drawing down reserves. We are using savings to be able to bolster our street preservation program. So it has not been consistent. It has lacked that dedicated funding revenue. So moving forward, what was proposed by the committee is to adjust the revenue stream, considering additional growth in property tax revenue. And as Sharon mentioned, that has somewhat limited because of measures 5 and 50, that tax assessed value can only by law go up 3% per year, and our tax rate is frozen. However, the new growth does generate some additional property tax revenue, as well as increased visitor activity. We did account for that and updated the transient room tax assumptions. So that is shown there in red, that additional ongoing revenue. And then as one of the exercises of just reallocating existing resources as well as drawing down reserves, you see those one-time expenditures in 2016 resulting from savings in 2017, some additional unexpected revenue that's really one-time, property sales, that's all one-time, a little bit of one-time revenue in 2017. And then moving forward, the funding gap is $2.7 million. So that's what identified a needed solution to fill that gap. So in summary, the committee wanted to improve the roads 5 PCI points in 5 years, to take a phased approach to take what originally was a $7.5 million annual funding requirement, and they dropped it down to $6 million to rebuild residential roads that are in such need of repair that maintenance would not work, to try to reduce that funding gap. To fill that proposal, they looked at existing revenue and both one-time and ongoing revenue. It still was not enough to fill that $6 million need, and so the fuel tax was the proposed recommended option that would generate $2.5 million annually, a 5-cent fuel tax would, and then it goes out to the voters this March 8th in a special election and would expire in 10 years unless reauthorized by the voters. Thank you for taking the time to get the information related to this tax measure and related budget information.